Just moments ago, a revelation shattered the iron walls of royal secrecy. Duchess Sophie, long known for her composure and loyalty, has broken her silence. Her stunning confession about a covert plan involving Camilla to sabotage Catherine's position in the royal succession has ignited a storm that Buckingham Palace can no longer contain. The truth is out, and it's more damning than anyone imagined. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The walls of Sandringham had hardly cooled from the tension of a royal luncheon when the first whispers began leaking through the corridors of power. A journalist close to the palace claimed Sophie had made an uncharacteristically bold statement in a closed gathering of senior royals, a statement so shocking that even seasoned aides were left speechless. According to the leak, Sophie had directly referenced a covert strategy, quietly circulating among Camilla's closest allies, aimed at diminishing Catherine's visibility in the line of succession. She allegedly called it by name Operation Clarion Eclipse. At first, many dismissed it as a misunderstanding or even a fabrication by outsiders hungry for scandal. But then more reports emerged. Attendees began offering subtle confirmations under anonymity. The tension in the room had been unmistakable. Sophie hadn't whispered it, she had spoken with purpose. Insiders now believe that Sophie's remarks were not a spontaneous outburst, but a calculated unveiling. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was an alarm bell, finally rung after months of silent observation. It's being reported that Sophie had grown increasingly disturbed by the shifts in tone and protocol surrounding Catherine. In particular, she had begun noticing that Catherine was being strategically left out of critical succession discussions, often being informed after decisions had already been made. Despite her growing suspicion, Sophie chose restraint until this luncheon, when something finally broke. Perhaps it was a look exchanged between Camilla and a senior aide. Perhaps it was the realization that no one else would speak unless she did. The response was immediate. Within minutes, a palace insider reportedly forwarded a transcript to an off-the-record royal press contact. The leak was deliberate. And by the time William was informed, the media machine had already latched onto the unfolding narrative. Sources claim his reaction was visibly shaken, not merely because of the content, but because it confirmed something he and Catherine had begun to suspect in hushed conversations. There was a silent war brewing within the palace, and they were at the heart of it. William, who had always considered Sophie an unwavering pillar of discretion, now saw her as the unlikely catalyst in what may become one of the monarchy's most defining confrontations. Though the royal press office refused to comment, and courtiers scrambled to contain the fallout, the damage had already spread. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't tabloid fantasy. It was the voice of a Duchess one who had stayed silent too long, now echoing through the palace walls. Camilla has yet to publicly respond, but multiple sources say her private circle is in disarray, struggling to assess how much Sophie knows and what else she may be willing to reveal. And as the world holds its breath, the royal family faces a reckoning it can no longer postpone. But to understand why Sophie chose this moment to speak and what dark forces were at play behind closed royal doors, we must go back to where the fractures first began, buried deep. Within confidential palace memorandums, the phrase Operation Clarion Eclipse sent chills down the spines of insiders. It was never meant to surface, but according to Sophie, this was the covert initiative allegedly championed by Camilla to realign the royal succession, and Catherine was the silent target. It began not as a decree, but as a whisperer phrase slipped into a conversation during a late-night succession review meeting, spoken only once and never written down officially. Clarion Eclipse, Sophie recalled, had been uttered by a senior Clarence House insider as if it were code, a project with no paper trail, no signatures, and no accountability. It didn't exist in the official royal ledger, yet decisions seemed to bend in its direction. And while Catherine continued fulfilling her duties with grace and growing public reverence, somewhere within the walls of power, a quiet erasure was already in motion. Sophie, known for her restraint and discretion, began noticing discrepancies, briefing documents missing Catherine's name. official rosters that subtly shifted responsibilities to others, and advisors who grew evasive when she inquired too directly. Sources now point to two senior advisors, one specializing in domestic succession policy and the other embedded within Camilla's ceremonial team, who reportedly bypassed standard royal council procedures to initiate a line of recommendations, masked as health contingency planning. But this was no benign precaution. Underneath the language of royal preparedness lay a strategic maneuver: isolate Catherine's role by casting her influence as volatile, unpredictable, and rooted in public popularity rather than institutional authority. In the eyes of certain traditionalists still clinging to older hierarchies, Catherine's immense public support wasn't a strength, it was a liability, a destabilizing force that needed to be contained before it overtook the old order. Sophie's suspicions crystallized during a succession review in early autumn. The discussion centered around long-term ceremonial assignments and state leadership in the event of an emergency transition. Names were listed. Catherine's wasn't among them. What was more disturbing, however, was the way no one else seemed surprised, as if the decision had already been made long before the meeting took place. When Sophie raised the issue, the conversation veered off course, cloaked in vague answers and bureaucratic language. It was a coordinated deflection. That night, Sophie returned to her quarters and wrote just 2 words in her journal: Clarion activated. What she uncovered in the following weeks confirmed her fears. Future state simulations, dry-run protocols, used to train aides and inform regional planning, had excluded Catherine entirely. Her potential leadership in constitutional matters was rerouted to alternative figures, including lesser-known royals and even external advisors. The implications were devastating. This wasn't a theoretical exercise, it was a map of a future where Catherine had been strategically written out. And yet, the more Sophie asked, the more doors were closed. Clarence's house remained silent. The Privy Council denied awareness. William, when informed privately, reportedly stared at the floor for several minutes before responding. It was no longer a question of if something was happening, it was a question of how far it had already gone. As the pieces fell into place, one question haunted Sophie: what else had Camilla orchestrated behind the veil of royal tradition? For months, Sophie recorded what she saw and heard in a discreet, leather-bound journal. Thought to be a personal coping tool, it has now become the smoking gun. In it are details too precise to dismiss coded mentions, strange omissions, and Catherine's name, circled in red ink. What began as a quiet exercise in self-preservation soon turned into something far more deliberate. Sophie never intended for anyone to read those pages, not at first. But each day brought a new inconsistency, a fresh unease, and her instincts, honed by years of royal duty, refused to ignore them. It started with small things, a missed invitation here, a subtle exclusion there. Catherine, once at the center of nearly every royal planning document, was slowly fading from the inner workings of palace life. What disturbed Sophie wasn't just the omissions, it was the silence that surrounded them. No one questioned the changes, no one explained them. It was as if everyone had been instructed to pretend nothing was different. But Sophie felt the shift, and her journal became the only place where the truth could live. Within the pages were observations marked by urgency and fear. She wrote about Camilla's increasingly sharp tone in meetings language, laced with double meanings, comments that seemed harmless to outsiders but, in context, carried weight. Phrases like stability over sentiment and the need to recalibrate expectations began to echo across conversations. More than once, Sophie noted that Camilla would refer to Catherine not by name, but as the front-facing figure, as though stripping her of identity was a step toward removing her influence altogether. Behind the royal polish, a storm was brewing, and Sophie was one of the few who could feel the temperature drop. The emotional toll was relentless. Sophie wrestled with the implications of every new entry. Her loyalty to the crown was foundational, unshakable, but the dread gnawing at her heart refused to be silenced. The deeper she went, the more apparent it became that this wasn't political posturing, it was a deliberate dismantling. She wrote of private documents quietly pulled from circulation, particularly those outlining Catherine's future diplomatic assignments and joint leadership roles with William. When she asked why, she was told the files were under review, but they never returned. What haunted her most were the patterns. Briefings arrived stripped of Catherine's name. Meetings shifted locations without notice. When Catherine would walk into a room, certain aides would exchange looks. It was subtle, but Sophie recognized it all for what it was: conditioning, the kind that prepares a system for a future where someone simply no longer belongs. The final straw came when Sophie overheard a junior assistant refer to a new initiative under Camilla's direction and whispered, "Don't worry, she won't be involved." The she was Catherine. Sophie's pen trembled as she wrote that evening's final line. They're rewriting the future without her. The weight of it all pressed down on her. And yet through every page, Sophie remained silent until now. Because what she discovered next would force her to confront the unimaginable, the role of her own silence in enabling a plan that could unseat the very future of the monarchy. A sealed red briefcase, 2 identical models. One meant for King Charles's review mysteriously vanished for 48 hours, and when it returned, key sections involving Catherine's future roles had been quietly omitted. Was it an administrative error, or something far more deliberate? The timing was not a coincidence. Just days before the New Year succession meeting, an annual exercise in contingency planning that quietly shapes the balance of royal power, one of the monarch's briefing briefcases went missing. It was only meant to leave the briefing office for transport to Charles's personal quarters. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Or rather, something was made to look wrong. The briefcase reappeared nearly 2 days later, discreetly returned to the circulation pool. Most would have overlooked the delay, until Sophie received a late-night call from her cousin, a junior aide in the very office responsible for briefing logistics. He wasn't calling to gossip. He was terrified. Because when the documents were audited, he discovered entire sections had been removed. And not just any sections, those specifically related to Catherine's leadership in future Commonwealth negotiations, international duties, and joint constitutional briefings alongside William. What Sophie did next would define the course of everything that followed. She asked to see the document history herself, not officially, quietly, off the books. What she saw mirrored her worst fears. Cross-referencing older drafts, it was clear these omissions weren't formatting errors. They were intentional. Paragraphs discussing Catherine's role in bridging generational leadership had been slashed. References to her as future consort in command were replaced with ambiguous phrases like supporting royal figure. Even more chilling, a line confirming her authority in the event of a dual absence of the King and Prince of Wales was simply gone. The implications were staggering. These weren't cosmetic edits. They were structural changes meant to weaken, dilute, and eventually erase Catherine's constitutional relevance. Sophie, always careful to avoid assumptions, looked for one last piece of confirmation. And it came, chillingly, from the palace security log. Camilla's former private secretary, a figure known for playing multiple roles behind the scenes, was listed as having accessed the office after hours on the exact night of the switch. He had no clearance to be there, no business logged, but he'd spent 43 minutes inside the file room, alone. When questioned by internal security later, he claimed he was searching for misplaced communications. The explanation didn't match the log. It didn't need to. By then, the edits had already been circulated. The narrative had been changed. King Charles himself remained in the dark. He only learned of the alterations months later, during a private discussion with Sophie. She presented the old version and the new one side by side. His response wasn't anger, it was confusion. A confusion that quickly turned to silence. He had signed the briefcase materials in good faith, unaware of the changes made in his name. And for Sophie, that was the final confirmation. This wasn't an error. It wasn't bureaucracy. This was sabotage executed in silence, designed to be irreversible, and cloaked in the very institution she had spent her life serving. And while the palace spun stories of clerical mix-ups, another force was already in motion, one far more personal and far more dangerous. Behind the gilded walls, a council of 3 loyalists, one legal, one ceremonial, one private, were reportedly advising Camilla on how to shift power silently. These were not elected advisors but hand-chosen allies, determined to ensure Catherine's role would be permanently ceremonial. They were known in whispers as the Quiet Council, and for good reason. Lord Brexley, the legal architect who had long navigated loopholes buried in centuries-old protocols. Lady Merrow, master of tradition, whose job was once preserving heritage, now reportedly used that very knowledge to manipulate precedents. And Sir Adam Westcott, with deep foreign relations ties, whose connections stretched into diplomatic circles Catherine had only just begun to command. Together they operated beyond scrutiny, no public appointments, no official roles, no record of their meetings, and yet their influence was undeniable. Sources within Clarence House confirmed that every Thursday, Camilla would summon them to her private drawing room, curtains drawn, no aides allowed, only those 3 and Camilla herself. The agenda? Reclassification. Under the guise of structural efficiency, the council allegedly pushed a narrative that Catherine's growing influence was perception-led, not grounded in constitutional authority. Her soaring public approval, her international poise, even her emerging leadership alongside William. Everything was reframed as optics, temporary, unofficial. Not to be reinforced, but to be moderated. It was the perfect justification to begin scaling back her responsibilities quietly, systematically, without alarm. And so they acted. Slowly at first, duties previously destined for Catherine began being rerouted. Princess Beatrice was offered an overseas foundation role, initially created with Catherine in mind. Lady Gabriella, rarely involved in state matters, suddenly became the palace's choice to represent certain historical preservation initiatives. Again, projects Catherine had been nurturing for years. Most damning were the events Catherine simply never heard about. Invitations she never received. Dockets that never reached her desk. She wasn't being removed with confrontation, she was being erased by omission. All the while, Sophie watched with unease, still trying to believe it was coincidence, miscommunication, perhaps even error. But week by week, her hope faded. Catherine had no idea what was being stripped from her plate. William, though increasingly concerned, was told to focus on preparing for his own future, and Charles, distracted by health complications and constitutional reviews, was shielded from the daily mechanics of decision-making. It was the perfect storm, and the Quiet Council knew it. When Sophie finally confronted one of the aides connected to the Thursday briefings, the response was clinical. Riallocati. On, they called it. Clarification of ceremonial lines. That was the moment Sophie realized these meetings weren't merely advisory. They were strategic, tactical. And they were succeeding. The palace had become a maze of smiles and subtext, where tradition cloaked ambition and silence served power. But what truly sealed Sophie's decision to speak out wasn't protocol, politics, or palace games. It was a single conversation she overheard between Camilla and a trusted foreign advisor. In the seclusion of the Windsor Gardens, Sophie accidentally found herself within earshot of a meeting that was never meant for her ears. What she heard confirmed her worst fears, Camilla discussing Catherine's containment with a high-ranking European delegate. It was late afternoon and Sophie, accompanied by her personal security detail, had taken one of her usual walks through the less frequented south quadrant of the royal gardens. The area was typically quiet, peaceful enough to allow her thoughts to settle. But on that day, serenity gave way to shock. Through the hedges, faint voices reached her ears. She paused, recognizing Camilla's tone first not in anger, but in strategy. The other voice was measured, foreign, and unmistakably diplomatic. It belonged to a European figure whose visits were never listed publicly. And what Sophie heard was not policy, it was plotting. Camilla's words were calm, but the content was razor-sharp. She referenced the necessity of neutralizing influence, a phrase Sophie would later write in her journal in capital letters. The discussion wasn't about optics or public missteps. It was about Catherine, about managing her presence, about ensuring she never rose beyond what they called an emotionally symbolic figure. What shook Sophie to her core was the casual mention of Appendix Windsor 4, a document that had been whispered about in Palace corridors for months, but never officially acknowledged. Rumored to be an internal addendum to the succession matrix, the appendix allegedly outlined alternative paths for power delegation in volatile scenarios. Until now, it had been palace folklore, but here it was, casually folded into a conversation about Catherine's fate. The delegate pushed back, asking bluntly if sidelining Catherine wouldn't cause public and internal backlash. His question wasn't moral, it was tactical. Could the crown survive the consequence? That's when Camilla's response froze the blood in Sophie's veins. "They'll accept what they're told," she reportedly said. "They always do." There was no concern, no caution, just certainty. And in that moment, Sophie understood. The entire strategy wasn't just unfolding, it was nearly complete. Every omission, every redirection, every vague denial was part of a wider framework designed not only to reduce Catherine's role, but to do so with such precision that no one would notice until it was far too late. Sophie stood in silence, her mind racing, her heart pounding beneath layers of forced calm. Her training told her to walk away and pretend she'd heard nothing. But this was no longer a matter of duty. This was the integrity of the monarchy itself. She left the gardens in visible distress. Her security team, though discreet, knew something had changed. That evening she opened her journal and wrote until her hand ached. Every word she could remember, every phrase, every detail, and when she finished, she made her decision. The journal would no longer remain private. It was time to speak, to risk everything, to stop what was happening before it became unchangeable history. But even as Sophie planned her reveal, the inner circle fought to keep the story buried, until one unexpected person gave her the platform she needed. Enter Prince Edward, the loyal brother, who had stayed silent for too long. When he learned of Sophie's emotional turmoil, he didn't just support her, he activated his own network to ensure her voice would be heard. What followed was a coordinated release that shook the monarchy's foundation. It began not with confrontation, but with quiet determination. Sophie had held on for as long as she could, burdened by secrets that had grown heavier with each passing day. She had tried to shield the crown, to protect Catherine, and to honor the silence demanded by her position. But when Edward saw the anguish in her eyes, he did not hesitate. He asked no questions about risk, reputation, or protocol. He simply said, "Tell me everything you know." And Sophie did. Every detail, every hidden meeting, every manipulation she had witnessed or overheard, what she thought would be a moment of confession became a moment of ignition. Edward didn't react with shock. He reacted with action. Within 24 hours, Edward had called in favors from trusted figures inside the palace's oldest corridors. People who had seen the quiet council's influence but felt powerless to stop it. With Edward's authority behind her, Sophie documented her full account dates, names, phrases, and direct entries from her private journal. But this time, her words weren't locked in leather. They were scanned, encrypted, and delivered to a short list of veteran royal correspondence journalists. No, not for tabloids, but for integrity. Every name on the list was chosen for their history of respecting the monarchy, and more importantly, for their refusal to be intimidated by it. To prevent any chance of interception, Edward bypassed Clarence House entirely. Instead, he sent a coded message directly to William through an old encrypted protocol once used for emergency royal military communications. The message was short but devastating: "She's not safe. The council is deeper than we knew. Sophie has the evidence." William's response was immediate. Cleared his schedule, took personal control of internal communication tracking, and ordered full lockdown of succession planning documents. The moment the leak hit the press, Clarence House scrambled for damage control, but it was too late. Sophie's words were everywhere. For the first time, the public saw her not as a background royal, but as the woman who dared to disrupt the silence. Commentators around the world called it the Quiet Rebellion. Social media erupted. Headlines didn't just mention Sophie, they celebrated her. And in the court of public opinion, Catherine's removal from future plan. Wasn't just suspicious, It was now undeniable. Perhaps the most powerful moment came behind closed doors. When Catherine received a private transcript of the leaked material, she was silent for nearly an hour. Those present described her as pale, shaking her head, whispering, "How could this happen? And why didn't I see it?" But it wasn't weakness. It was awakening. The betrayal had cut deep, but what Sophie and Edward had done gave her more than proof. It gave her voice back. The quiet council had been exposed. Its authority collapsed almost overnight. Schedules were suspended, titles reviewed, and the machinery that once threatened to erase her ground to a halt. But with the storm now raging in full view, it was Catherine herself who had to decide what came next and how she would face the one who tried to erase her. All eyes turned to Catherine, expecting fury, retaliation, or royal declarations. But behind palace doors, her response was quiet, piercing, and unforgettable. Rather than rage, she delivered resolve. Her decision would redefine not only her image but the future of the crown. There was a moment silent and suspended in time when Catherine entered the private chamber, where Charles, William, and Sophie waited. No reporters, no aides, just the people at the center of a storm that had pulled the monarchy into its most fragile reckoning in decades. What Catherine carried with her wasn't a legal brief or a demand for retribution. It was a handwritten letter, sealed in a soft white envelope, titled with 6 words that would echo through every royal hall thereafter: legacy, not lineage. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, but the weight of her words fell like thunder. She did not accuse. She did not seek vengeance. What she did instead was something no one had anticipated. She asked for reform. She refused to fuel the fire of scandal, She would not allow silence to return as the norm. Catherine made one thing clear: she would not allow future generations, be they royal by birth or by duty, to be erased behind closed doors. She requested the immediate drafting of a charter, one that would prevent any internal manipulation of succession lines, titles, or constitutional roles, without full council transparency and oversight. No more backroom meetings, no more invisible councils, no more names quietly removed from history. Charles listened with tearful eyes, his health waning but his awareness now fully awakened. For perhaps the first time, he saw not just his daughter-in-law, but the woman who had protected the crown, more fiercely than those who claimed to lead it. He didn't hesitate. The Windsor Integrity Council was his answer, a permanent royal body empowered to safeguard succession planning, heritage, and internal governance, independent of individual influence. It would bear Catherine's imprint, but exist beyond her tenure. It would become her shield for those who would follow. William stood in silence as Catherine spoke, his jaw clenched, his loyalty torn between his love for her and the institution that had nearly shattered her. But when she finished, he stepped forward not to speak, but to take her hand. And Sophie, whose courage had ignited this reckoning, was pulled into Catherine's embrace. No words were needed. Catherine simply whispered, "You were the voice I didn't know I needed." For the first time in months, there was peace, not because the battle was over, but because someone had finally decided to rise above it. Catherine's decision not to retaliate but to rebuild sent a message louder than any royal proclamation: strength does not come from position, but from principle. Her silence, once weaponized against her, had now become the most powerful statement of all. But one chapter still remains unfinished, and it involves the Queen Consort herself, and whether she will ever address the storm she helped unleash. As the monarchy scrambles to heal, Camilla remains publicly silent. No press statement, no denial, but behind palace walls, her once commanding presence is said to have diminished. The question now is not whether Catherine was nearly removed, but how history will remember those who tried. The ripple effect of Sophie's revelation and Edward's intervention spread far beyond the confines of royal protocol. What had once been concealed beneath tradition and ceremony now stood exposed beneath the raw light of public scrutiny. Yet amid the shockwaves, one voice remained conspicuously absent: Camilla's. She cancelled 2 scheduled public appearances in rapid succession without providing a reason. Her aides released a cold, calculated response to mounting press inquiries: no comment at this time. But silence, in moments of reckoning, speaks louder than words. And in this case, it echoed like an admission. Within the palace, the air had shifted. Where Camilla once held court with quiet dominance, there was now retreat. Senior aides loyal to her were reassigned. Her informal briefings with select council members ceased entirely. And in the one moment that perhaps mattered most, William faced her not with outrage, but with a distance so sharp it cut deeper than confrontation. Cold but composed, one insider described him. There was no shouting, just a stare that said everything, "I know what you did." Charles, for his part, walked a line as fragile as the crown he bore. He loved his wife, of that there was never any doubt. But he was king first, and after seeing the evidence with his own eyes, after reading the documents, hearing Catherine's letter, and witnessing the public outcry, he made a quiet but decisive move. Camilla was no longer included in succession discussions. She was not consulted. She was not informed. The man who had once leaned on her for counsel now locked the door she used to enter without knocking. It wasn't punishment. It was preservation. Outside the gates of Windsor and Buckingham, the public delivered its verdict with unmistakable clarity. Polls showed a seismic shift in perception. Catherine's favourability surged to its highest recorded level, while Camilla's approval quietly collapsed. Commentators described it as a moral restoration, the public siding with resilience over manoeuvring, with grace over ambition. The narrative had changed forever, not just because of what was exposed, but because of who stood firm when it mattered. And yet, one truth remains undeniable. Clarion Eclipse may have failed, but its memory will never fade. It now exists not as rumour, but as a permanent part of palace history, sealed within the archives, studied by future generations as a cautionary tale of ambition masked as duty. The names involved may fade with time, but the betrayal itself will never be fully erased. It is now etched into the story of the monarchy, a reminder that power, even within tradition, can be abused in silence. And so, as one duchess broke her silence, an entire monarchy was forced to confront its shadow. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.